Let me continue with the video lecture for Chapter 4. This is Part 3. So far in Part 1, we talked about the concept of socialization, the ways in which a person internalizes some of the rules or notions of how to function within a society. In Part 2, we talked about the difference between status and roles and how we can see a group of different statuses that individuals might have, which we'd call a status set, or the idea of an achieved or ascribed status, with the former being something that is innate, and the latter being something that, of course, a person could achieve, could be able to adopt or accept on his or her own. We're now up to the idea of the social construction of reality, and the idea here relates to one of the big three concepts that I've talked about before in class: symbolic interactionism. When you think about the ways in which we have socialization, including the ways in which individuals will have a particular status and the role that comes with that particular kind of status, we can end up seeing interactions of individuals as the process by which symbolic interaction can take place. So the idea of the symbolic interaction looks at the types of words or conduct that would have particular types of symbolic meanings. Understand that while there may be a human capacity to transmit information, whether orally or through behavior, that these can be relative concepts. So for example, you may have heard in a different context the ways in which in some societies you're not supposed to do certain kinds of things. You might see, for example, as was the case in the 1990s, when the president's wife was visiting nations where it was the custom for women to have veils, that she would wear a kind of a veil out of respect for the customs of that particular country where she was visiting. And so in that sense, by wearing a veil, something that Mrs. Clinton did not do, at least publicly on a regular basis, she is attempting to conform to the norms of a particular society, and through that behavior is trying to demonstrate respect for the particular norms. The idea of symbolic interactionism means that we're transmitting ideas or concepts and values, and we look at the ways in which social processes create those meanings. Although, of course, since there have been humans, there have been times when individuals go through a transition phase from childhood to adult, and while that phase might change at when it would occur, depending upon the particular level of technological advancement in society, some say that it was not until the 1950s that you saw the creation of what it meant to be a teenager. The idea then of teenager was a social construct. It was separate from whether or not an individual was in fact a teenager. So what you ended up seeing was the development of a kind of a culture around teenagers. The idea that we now lived in a post-World War II society where there was greater freedoms and opportunities for those individuals to be able to engage in different types of activities, not the least of which would mean that they wouldn't necessarily have to work when it became physically possible for them to be able to work. A more contemporary example of the development of these kinds of roles is the social concept of tweens. That is, individuals between the ages of 9 and 12, and that our society is starting to look at these individuals and seeing that their behavior is not quite that of a teenager, but clearly is different from a child. For example, marketers look at the idea of tweens and figure out that since these are individuals who will, generally speaking, for birthdays be able to receive money, means that they are individuals who could be consumers. So marketers may end up creating campaigns to target these particular individuals. What you end up seeing, therefore, is that meanings come about because of social interaction in a particular society. They can be interpreted or filtered in a number of ways, dealing with an interpretive process that each individual uses in dealing with outward signs. So One particular way that you could end up seeing symbolic interactionism unfolding is the so-called dramaturgical theory associated with the sociologist by the name of Guffman. And what you end up seeing here is that in dramaturgical theory, first off, you're understanding that drama is the first part of that word. So you'll see some of the metaphor that would be coming from stagecraft or theater. That this theory ends up focusing on impression management, a way in which people end up using roles or practicing roles to be able to convey a particular kind of impression. So that, to use the metaphor here, front stage behavior, this will relate to those behaviors that individuals practice in public. The idea of front stage behavior is that it starts from a premise that individuals have less control of their lives out in public, and therefore they may choose a particular way in which they present themselves to the world, where backstage behavior would be more confidential and private, and the individuals might end up having much more control of how to manage the particular impressions that they create. Look at, for example, the contrast between front stage behavior of such as children in school versus backstage behavior, how they act at home. The difference between the two is that at home there might be, for example, less formality to interactions between children and parents. Working a variation on this theme of the dramaturgical theory is the idea of face. So what we're dealing with is primarily front stage behavior having to do with esteem, so that the idea of loss of face, as the phrase goes, is that an individual suffers a particularly public embarrassment, and that embarrassment leads to a sense of shame because the individual has failed to control his or her particular esteem behavior to prevent such kinds of breaches. The idea is, of course, that once we see a situation like that, we may end up having members in the audience themselves understanding that there was a loss of face, where such breaches occur, and so gives rise to the idea of tact, that is, behavior that helps an individual recover face when there has been some kind of a breach that led to the loss of face, so that tact might be the way in which we figure out how to be able to return an individual to a level of self-esteem within a particular social context. We could go to the other extreme, if you will, that the idea of tact talks about breaking rules so as to make someone else feel comfortable. Its opposite might be civic inattention, where it is as if a particular individual is invisible, that they're being ignored, that it doesn't matter whether or not they've lost face. What you see is that in a particular individual, this person has become invisible. If symbolic interactionism talks about the ways in which individuals choose to present themselves, ethnomethodology, a term coined by Harold Garfinkel, looks at these particular social interactions. Garfinkel's perspective was to challenge these particular types of norms. So Garfinkel would ask students to go into the social role and engage in breaching experiments, that is, behavior where they break the role, where they fail to conform to a particular kind of behavior, so that we might see somebody pretending to be in law enforcement, and when confronted with a situation which might require the use of force, the person turns and runs away. In what way have new technologies changed individuals and the kinds of interactions that they have? And pretty clearly, we're talking at least the ways in which people act with their smartphones and with or on the internet, that the process of doing something like I am doing now, speaking to a particular camera, or more likely the behaviors that individuals will exhibit using something like Skype means that people may end up interacting differently. When you think about the methods of interaction on something like Facebook or Twitter, you see people using words in a particular way. You may see the rise of those shorthand symbols called emoticons, which might convey a particular reaction, or the kinds of acronyms that people would use, such as LOL, laugh out loud. What the internet also does, besides testing roles, is provide opportunities for being able to understand the implications of adopting certain kinds of roles, so that we look at the ways that individuals end up changing their roles with something like illegal downloads, that individuals might download music or video illegally and rationalize it away in some fashion. That either type of creative act is something that a large corporation has used to generate a lot of money, and therefore they won't really miss the potential sale that would come otherwise from having access to that information. A last point talks about the so-called Harlem's Children's Zone, which looks at the degree to which individuals could be at a social disadvantage because of poverty. And so the success of this particular type of program suggests that there may be a way to manage roles better in a school-type setting to be able to improve the quality of the roles that individuals could end up having, that the impact of economics may not be necessarily so powerful. So that gives you an idea of what's going on in this particular idea about socialization, where individuals adopt certain kinds of roles based on a status, and through interactions learn what to expect from people. These types of interactions can run the gamut from manners that relate to who ends up going first out a door, or on a larger scale, what to expect from individuals as members in a family, that there might be expectations about the particular status or role of these individuals. So that's part 3 of the video lecture for chapter 4, and that is all that I'll have to say for chapter 4 at this time.